rolling. We just gonna roll.
We just gonna keep it rolling. So to talk about his forthcoming or their forthcoming book, forgive me, Garrett Felber is here to join us to talk about Martin Sostre and their forthcoming book on this underappreciated revolutionary. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I didn't know I'd be coming on after Birds, so I hope I can deliver.
Do your best, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
do what you can, you know.
If it helps, Garrett, I didn't know you were gonna come after Birds either. I would.
Okay. I just want to be clear that I will not have any sort of. It will just be me talking. So. No, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, Garrett, for joining. So everyone, on Wednesday, May 7th, if you are in New Jersey or able to get out to Orange, New Jersey, my abolition group, in coordination with some other folks, are bringing Garrett in to talk about his new book that's about to come out, which I'm very excited, to kind of have this opportunity to talk about a continuous struggle. You can pre-order. The book actually gets released on Tuesday for folks who are able to get to New Jersey. We will have copies of the book, and Garrett, I believe we have pressured into sitting around to sign copies of the book at the end of our event. But Garrett, do you want to introduce yourself and let folks know kind of like who you are and how you ended up down this space of really making sure that people understand who Martin Sostre was?
Yeah, for sure. I'm Garrett. I use they pronouns. I've most recently been organizing with Study and Struggle. We support radical study groups in prisons, mostly at state-designated women's prisons in Mississippi. I'm currently working on building a radical mobile library out in Portland, Oregon, where I live. And Martin, I really first became aware of Martin Sostre's work about 15 years ago. I was working on my dissertation, which became my first book on the Nation of Islam's organizing in prisons. And I came across Martin's name and, just did a Google search. And at the time, there wasn't a whole lot about him. There was a Wikipedia page that mentioned, his frame up in Buffalo for running a revolutionary bookstore during the uprising of 1967. And so I found his address and just wrote him a letter. I was trying to interview him, and he was basically like 90 years old and told me he was too busy, and sent me a bunch of primary sources. And we wrote back and forth a little bit before he passed in 2015. And I was just, I was fascinated by his work in the Nation when he was inside as a jailhouse lawyer. I was interested in his book selling. I was interested in his writings about revolutionary struggle. Then I found out about all this community work he was doing in New Jersey in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And so that just kind of led me to decide to try to piece all that together into a biography. So that's what I spent the last 5 years or so doing.
Ray, sorry, go ahead. Did you want to?
No, you go.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on what you just said there, and admittedly, I am thinking about this weekly series I've been doing on 100 Years of Malcolm X, and I, in reading this interview that you did with Truth Out that Renee sent me earlier, because I don't know much about Sostre, so this is all fascinating. I've already pre-ordered your book. I'm looking forward to I've only been learning about him at all over these last few years, to be honest, just recently. But in that interview, it is mentioned that it's Sostre's work in the Nation of Islam while in prison as a jailhouse lawyer that he reaches out to Malcolm X. And initially, when it's brought up in the interview, I was a little bit worried because we don't get to read of Malcolm's response immediately. So it's for a second I thought, oh man, I hope Malcolm didn't miss the letter or ignore the letter or whatever. And thankfully, as you point out, he did not. If it's not too much of a detour, could you talk about, because I know this is part of Martin's development, somewhat politically and somewhat like Malcolm's. Could you talk a little bit about their interaction and to whatever extent they had a relationship. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I knew more about the intricacies of whether they corresponded with one another, how the mentorship happened. But Martin was basically part of a group of incarcerated Muslims at Clinton and Attica during the late 50s, early 60s, who were being persecuted for their organizing and religious beliefs, and who, really led by Martin's jailhouse lawyering, were filing these cases that were first ostensibly around access to the Quran and things like that, and then second about sort of the punishment that they were undergoing for their religious beliefs, about solitary, the loss of good time. But historically at that time, imprisoned people have no constitutional rights. So to sort of access any of these rights, it's really actually raising a much larger question about, do imprisoned people have constitutional rights? And that's the broader context that they were asking Malcolm then to come to Buffalo and testify as an expert witness, because what the state was trying to do was say, this is not a legitimate religion. You know, this is in the parlance of today, right? They would say a threat group, terrorists. You know, at the time they were calling them a hate group. So it's the same tools that the state uses, right, to delegitimize, you know, liberation struggles and say that these are hate groups. And so Malcolm goes and testifies in court in the case where Sostre is a plaintiff. And so there's actually this interesting kind of interaction where Sostre is testifying, and he gets himself into kind of some hot water when he's testifying, because he's pretty, he's not placating to the judge or anything like that. And Malcolm kind of has this exchange with him where he's like, oh, you know, basically like this person kind of is misunderstanding or misrepresenting Islam. And the reason, and I think it's strategic, right? Because Malcolm's saying, like, if he had better religious instruction, he would understand. And it's like, because that's what Malcolm's doing, right, is to say, well, what we need to do is actually be allowed, ministers need to be allowed to come into the prison. We need to send religious
And then he wouldn't be making these mistakes.
Exactly. Then he wouldn't be making these mistakes. And one of the other things that I just love about that story, and this comes up in Orasami Burton's book too, is that Malcolm was coming in as a Christian minister. So he would put on the garb and come in and say he was a Christian minister, and that's how they're getting the lessons in. So yeah, there's a fascinating history there.
You're welcome, Jared.
Thank you indeed.
So I have to say, I also know very, very little about Sostre's history and the story, and it's been fascinating since, you know, Greg reached out and said we're going to do this book release, to kind of read some of the information and to learn a little bit more. And I think we need to like ping you to come back so we could talk more, like beyond, like there's a book release coming, and everybody come out, because your research is fascinating. Like what I've been reading about some of the things that you did with your PhD and, you know, your first book that you released, I'd love to kind of get more behind those things also as we go. But you know, and you know, I shared that article from Truth Out with Jared because I felt like it gave a really good, both concise and like in depth, just like where you come from with this, and trying to make sure that people understand how important it is to really get to learn, right? And to get information. And you say something at the end of the article that really struck me, because it feels like something that I always like. It's a way, I don't know how to explain it, but it really kind of just struck me because it's exactly how I like to think about things. And you were talking about political education, and you quote Tony Cade Bambara, but then you say, I think the role of the educator is to make revolutionary ideas accessible. Some people will be drawn to art and cultural production, others to books and the written word, and still others to care work and developing relationships. In a world that needs to be reimagined and rebuilt on every level, we can't afford to struggle narrowly. And it was just, one, I need to thank you for, I don't know if you were like talking off the cuff or if something that you say regularly.
No, that was an emailed response, so I will fess up to that.
But it's
like that.
It's beautifully stated, and it's something, you know, part of part of a lot of the things that I argue with people about all the time within my organizing space is that like our job is to bring people out, right? And to engage in conversations and to not just, you know, have these kind of surface level things where we present things, but to actually engage with the community in a way that they can ask questions and really and try to like gain more from it. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of like what, you know, so you write this book, the book's going to come out. I'm hoping that you'll get more people who want to like have conversations with you and discourse, and that people will read the book. Can you talk about like what's your, like if your dream came true about like what the result of this book coming out would be? What would be the end result for you?
Wow. It's funny to write a book and never like quite pinpoint that, you know? I mean, I wrote the book, I'll say first off, like I wrote the book really with incarcerated readers in mind. Like I've been sending manuscripts to my comrades inside throughout the process. And I think like that's one of the like smaller goals, is just for this book to really get inside, and for people to see the ways that Martin struggled from the inside. And I think for people outside to understand the role of incarcerated people in revolutionary struggle. Like there's a section in the book where I talk about this conflict with the Boggses, with Grace and Jimmy Boggs and Martin, about whether Martin was engaging in what they called like a sort of struggle for himself, because he was resisting so-called rectal examinations. And they were like, he's building a Sostre struggle. And he was like, no, I'm a one-person version of the Viet Cong. And so he saw his own resistance to sexual assault inside in relation to, you know, liberation struggles around the world. And they were like, oh, he's building a movement about it around himself. And so the reason I really like spend some time on that in the book is because I think it's a great example of how even revolutionary organizers can discount the role that imprisoned people play in revolutionary struggle. I see Jared's about to say something.
I mean, because, you know, you said one man Viet Cong.
Now listen, that's called my...
That is very animating for me. That is very, you know, and in that article, you know, you talk about Martin's, you know, the propaganda of deed, which I really like. The idea that even one person's solitary individual action, which we don't often think, or I think we're not often encouraged to think of in terms of collective struggle, but just one person's activity is itself propaganda. And you use that example of resisting those invasive examinations to say, you know, in that moment, it can't be collective. You're by yourself. You're trapped. So I'm a one man Viet. Oh, that is awesome. So yeah.
So to answer your question, Renee, because I started narrowly, I think the broad goal, like the thing that would be my dream scenario, is not just that people, you know, I think there's a growing awareness around Martin Sostre's life and struggle regardless of this book. Like it's been really encouraging over the last 5 years through the work we've done with the Martin Sostre Institute and events and things. So I think people will know Martin. What I would hope for is that people know Martin's ideas and struggle in a like kind of material way, that when people talk about him, it's not to just kind of add him to, like Robin writes in the foreword to the book. I really appreciate this. He's talking about this t-shirt of like more Malcolm than Martin. And he sort of uses that t-shirt to interject Martin Sostre into the conversation. But what I would hope for is not that just people now are like claiming a new figure to, you know, quote or mobilize or to tear some other figure down, but like that they actually engage with the ideas in the book and like apply them to their own struggles in the world. So that's what I hope, is that they can find ways through either Martin's struggle or the people who struggled with him and around him. Like I try to give attention to all of those people, because, you know, there are things that Martin does in the book that not all people are going to be willing to do. Or find themselves in the position to do. So I hope that there's ways that they can see other people engaging in revolutionary struggle that appeal to them or feel like on-ramps.
Can we get an example of what you think you mean that would make that he that would make people uncomfortable in terms of what he did? Or
Well, I mean,
be in position to do.
Yeah, so he withstood, almost a dozen brutal assaults by prison guards, right, to make this decision not to submit to rectal examinations. Even within his own context, he talks about how there's 2,000 people at the prison he's at and only maybe 5 who are willing to join him. He's calling for a strike against sexual assault, basically. And there's maybe 5 people who will join him in that. And part of kind of what I try to do in the book is like, he's really frustrated with that at the time. And he's like, he likens it to a boxing match. And he's like, there's a lot of people who want to see the boxer get hit, but nobody wants to get in the ring. And that's real. But I also think there's these ways that kind of, from writing a book, from my perspective, of all these years later, I see the continuity of people who are still resisting these searches inside in Martin's legacy. And so his resistance to it radiates outward, right? Even though not everyone's going to be willing to do that. So yeah, that's just one example that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Now listen, that's called my boy.
We do take bars requests sometimes. So,
Garrett, I want you to know that it's almost unheard of for someone who has been on screen for 15 minutes to get the bars twice. I just want you to know.
So I should just get off the call now. I won't take any invitations to come back.
In the article I did read, there was something I cannot wait to read the book. I'm not proud of how late I am to this work and this man's life and all of that. But there's a point in the article or the interview where you talk about how Sostre's reading of Marxist Leninism was negative in that it encouraged people not to act. And I have to admit, I'm not clear on that, how he or anyone would arrive at that, similar to my thoughts on Afro-pessimism, by the way, but that's a whole other can of worms. But, because when obviously the Panthers are an easy example to point to as a Marxist-Leninist inspired group that obviously acted. George Jackson clearly was not unwilling to act. I don't feel discouraged from action when I engage those ideas. So could you say a word or two about what we might maybe read more about in your book that he argues along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was responding to both the idea that there is a sort of revolutionary condition that people were sort of searching for, like what are the things that make for revolutionary conditions, and the way that sort of thinking might lead people to say, well, is it now or is it now? And he was like, you make revolutionary conditions, right? They're around us all the time and all these opportunities, and just take action. And that's what both builds those conditions, and they're ever present. And I think too, he saw organizations that would take what he saw as kind of anarchist spontaneous action, like the 1967 uprising in Buffalo. Like he signals that as his first awareness of the revolutionary potential of anarchism, even though he doesn't really identify as an anarchist for maybe 6 more years. And what he sees is the way that this spontaneous action in the streets then gets kind of disciplined by organizations, which during that time were mostly Marxist-Leninist, and kind of like funneled into a party line. And he was seeing that and saying, look, this is a way that this kind of revolutionary action then becomes subdued, funneled into like, well, what is our line on this? What is our line on that? And that's, I think what he was talking about. And, he's also coming out of like in that moment, this very specific break with the Workers' World Party, where they had been supporting him. They were part of his defense committee, and he breaks with them in 1970. So he's having, I mean, it's not like just a abstract argument he's making. It's one grounded in.
And it sounds like you said they shelved his book as a result. That's trifling. Shame on them. They should have put the book out, break or not. But
well, anyway. I think it was more like he didn't have anyone. They were the ones who wrote the book, so he was kind of counting on them to like be getting the book out. So it's not
which
so
they
much
still
like
should have. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
even if they had an issue with him or broke with him. But all right. Yeah. Renee,
the last notes. So Garrett, thank you. I know this was short. We are definitely going to circle back to you after the book comes out, because I do think it's probably a worthwhile venture to talk a little bit more about what's in the book, and some of your other research and things of that nature. Is there anything that you want to add, kind of, to close out about Martin or about the book? There's a link on our run sheet to order the book from AK Press. There are two places. I didn't only drop the one link because that was the one that was available through the Truth Out article. But I understand that there are two places that if people buy the book from either those bookstores, a copy will automatically be sent inside for someone who's currently incarcerated to get access to the work. So I want to make sure that we allot the ability for folks to support in that way. But is there anything else that you want to add, before we close out?
No, I think, thank you for having me on. If people want, in the meantime too, like, you don't have to just buy the book. You can check out the Martin Sostre Institute and read some of Martin's writings. The New Prisoner is this incredible analysis of, in the immediate aftermath of Attica, of Martin thinking through, the role of incarcerated people in revolutionary struggle. So checking out some of Martin's writings. And then also I'll plug the Justice for Geraldine and Martin campaign out of Buffalo. His co-defendant, Geraldine Pointer, is still alive in Buffalo and calling for her exoneration. She did over 2 years in prison and lost custody of her 5 kids for the frame up. So there's a cool movement happening there to reclaim the space of 1412 Jefferson, where the Afro-Asian bookstore was, to get her name cleared. So I think they're on Instagram. You can check them out, Justice for Geraldine and Martin. And thanks again for having me on.
No, definitely look forward to having
Thank you.
another discussion or two when the book comes out. Congratulations, and
Definitely.
salute to AK Press for that arrangement too. I like that you all are doing that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
folks in Jersey, again, pull up. We'll be at the Hub in Orange on May 7th. The event starts at 6, and Garrett's going to be in attendance. We're going to view one of the documentaries about Martin as part of the event. I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in person, Garrett. So, everything's become so online that you don't get to do that often. But
yeah, 3D.
I know, right? So thank you. Thank you very much for coming on, and really appreciate your time.
Right on. Take care.
Same. Thanks, y'all.